Stacy Hodgkinson and Amy Lewin. And they were researching teen pregnancy. So there are two participants, the partnered participants in question, and the female teenager that's pregnant is 15 years old. Her partner, who's enrolled in the study, is 24 years old. When they engaged in the sexual relationship, she lied and he lied, and so at the time of the sexual encounter, neither of them knew that they were engaging in sexual assault of a minor. Okay, so the participants have disclosed their age to the researcher, and at this point, this is blowing up. Because now the researchers know that they have a 24-year-old who's impregnated a 15-year-old, and this is against the law. Okay, so what did the researchers do? By law, they had to report it. These researchers were in positions where they were mandatory reporters, which means that if they became aware of sexual abuse, they had to report it. So let me ask you a different question. If these researchers were to continue with their research, and what safeguards you think could have been put into place to have created a better context for this so we weren't in a situation where everybody's in an awkward position? Because again, this is the whole point of research ethics, is we want to try and prevent these things before they even happen. Go ahead. Yeah, okay, so one of the first things they could have done is they could have said, what is the exact research question? And could this research question be researched in a way that would not necessarily involve recruiting participants who may have such an age gap? So it could involve restricting it so that the partner and the impregnating partner are both under 19, or it could be that both are over 18, or it could be that they're looking at different family structures. Excellent.
We'll keep everything confidential unless we find blank or blank or blank.
Okay, so this is an excellent point, which is that the researchers, and I'm sure they did this, but obviously not as well as they could have, gone through an informed consent process, and part of that informed consent process is telling the participants, if we discover this information, we are required to report it, and reminding the participant that they don't necessarily have to share that information. Excellent. Okay. Yeah, so there's ways that, again, if maybe the partner isn't involved, so we're not putting another participant at legal risk. You know, if you have the research participant who is just the female pregnant person, and you're asking that person questions, you could then ask about the circumstances of their impregnation and finding out this information without necessarily needing to know the name or the contact information or the identity of the other person. So it's it's okay for a researcher to discover that these activities are happening within the context of research, but the researcher needs to be very, very familiar with where that line is of when they become a mandatory reporter. Okay, I see lots and lots of hands, but we want to debrief this information and make sure that we're starting to connect it to the concepts in the course. Okay, so first thing to know is because of the potential for harms like this case that we just discussed, it's really important that someone other than the researchers themselves, who can get clouded, right? You get excited about an idea, you're not able to think about it objectively. Someone other than the researcher needs to review this. So in Canada, these are called research ethics boards. Now, if you're reading content just in general, you might also see these referred to as institutional review boards. But in Canada, we very specifically call them research ethics boards. REBs, as they are abbreviated, are committees established by institutions to review and monitor research involving humans. REB committees include researchers, with at least one of those researchers being an expert in the area of research, ethicists, community members, and people knowledgeable of the law. When REBs are assessing risk, first of all, they're looking for risk attributable to the research study. Okay, so somebody may be engaged in drug use, and if the researcher is studying that drug use, the fact that drug use is harmful, potentially, to the person isn't necessarily the types of risks they're looking for. They're going to ask, does the research increase that harm? Okay? So what they do is they often compare it to what's called the risk that people are likely to encounter in their day-to-day lives. So if somebody is using, sort of illicit drugs that are harmful to them, that may be the reality of that particular population of individuals' day-to-day lives. So researching that illicit drug use isn't necessarily putting the person at greater risk per se, unless there are elements of the study that increase that risk. Okay, so they're looking for risks attributable to the research, and then they're also comparing it to what a person might counter in their day-to-day lives. Okay, so there's a case study on our activity related to this, looking at studying racist content. So there was a researcher in Michigan that took racist comments from online. These were real racist comments that existed in an online atmosphere, and then wanted to get participants' reactions to them. And they went through all the ethics board approvals, and they had an informed consent process, but the participants themselves pushed back against the idea that this was not increasing harm, right? Because it turns out that you can avoid those racist comments in your day-to-day lives, but if you're forced to read them as part of a research study, you can't avoid them. Okay, so again, this also has to be considered from the perspective of the research participants themselves. The researchers don't get to decide what's harmful versus not. It's really from the viewpoint of the participants, and it's ongoing, right? So if we discover risks that we were not expecting, then we have to go back and revisit. So risk that's greater than minimal risk doesn't necessarily mean that the study can't go forward, but it does mean that the Research Ethics Board gives it extra scrutiny, and it means that the researcher has to justify the importance of the study, and they have to put those specific safeguards into place to minimize risk and protect the welfare of the research participants. So one of the things that if we're talking about privacy, we need to find ways to protect people's information. So let's say we're studying illicit drug use. One way that we could do this is we could simply collect the data anonymously. We can avoid putting people in legal jeopardy. We can avoid putting ourselves in these ethical dilemmas by finding ways just to create a point of separation between the participants and ourselves in terms of, keeping things anonymous. So this online data collection has kind of revolutionized research in certain areas because it makes anonymous data collection so much easier. Okay? So one of the ways that we can do this is we can simply ask people to report information about themselves without necessarily needing to know who they are. Okay? This isn't always possible, as you can imagine, right? So if you're doing a study that unfolds over several weeks, you may need to collect that identifying information. So one of the ways that researchers can protect identifying information and protect private information is creating a code book. So instead of the data being collected with so like we think about the OkCupid, so if we were to go back and redo those studies with better safeguards, then we might find ways that we can kind of decouple all of that information that could be combined, become identifying. So instead of having everybody's responses together, maybe having them, kind of in separate spreadsheets and things. Okay, so just to kind of break this down, if you're collecting data over time, so you need to know somebody's contact information so that you can keep contacting them, what often will happen is you'll have one database that includes the identifying information, the names and the contact information, and then it'll have a participant code. Okay, that code is then linked to the data. Now, this data is not anonymous because somebody has access to the code sheet as well as the data, usually the lead researcher or a project manager, so they can connect it. Okay, so that's not anonymous data because it is still identifiable. But if the researcher wants to share this with another research team, consistent with this principle of transparency, one of the things they could do is they can engage in what is called anonymized data, which is where they can delete the code book that has the information about the identifiers. Okay, so they delete it so that nobody has access to that information anymore. And then at that point, the data would be described as anonymized. Now, researchers make important distinctions between data that was collected anonymously, without any identifiers ever being attached to it, and anonymized data which once had identifiers attached to it but no longer do. Okay, so it's a nuanced difference, but there is a difference between those two. Another way to protect private information is that sometimes you can't protect it, right? Sometimes if you learn that there's an age discrepancy that indicates sexual child abuse, you have to report it. Part of this is an informed consent process. If you come to my office and you sit down, if you say, can I tell you something, and you won't tell anyone, I'm going to say, yes, but if you reveal to me that you are a danger to yourself or others, then I have an ethical responsibility to make sure that you get help and that others are safe, okay? So that's me giving you the information that you need to decide if you now want to tell me the information or not. Okay, so this is a hallmark of informed consent. So participants are told what kinds of information will be collected, how the information will be stored, and the limits of these protections. And informed consent is a core hallmark of respect. Respect for persons requires that researchers and RABs respect the autonomy of research participants, and researchers and RABs also have a responsibility to protect those who may lack the capacity to make their own decisions. And sometimes this issue becomes complex. Is a 15-year-old pregnant teenager capable of making informed consent on her own? And on one hand, the answer is maybe not, because this person's still a child. On the other hand, this person is about to take care of a baby for the next 18 years of their life. They've probably had to grow up very, very fast, and that may put them in a position where they are capable of making those autonomous decisions. So there's not always an easy yes or no answer as to whether somebody is capable of providing consent or not. Quick question? Okay, so this is a great question. In research involving minors, the researchers will always speak to the parents. And the answer to that is yes and no. So I would say, instead of saying always, I would say that the researchers usually speak to the parents. Okay? So again, working in collaboration with a research ethics board, the researchers, along with the REB, would make a determination as to whether or not parental consent is required. Typically, it is required. At the same time, if it's a really low minimal risk study where somebody's like going into a school and asking, do you like the brown puppet or the blue puppet? Then, maybe they say, hey, that's fine. If we're talking about something like runaway teenagers, so these are teenagers that have, for whatever reason, chosen to leave their homes and are no longer living with their family of origin, then there may be good, compelling reasons to protect the safety of those teenagers by not involving a guardian. So again, it's often on a case-by-case basis. Consent is the means by which individuals express their willingness to participate in research. And just as you probably know that consent in other contexts, so we've been talking about sexual activity, consent in sexual activity should be voluntary, ongoing, informed. Consent in a research context is very similar in its principles. It needs to be voluntary, it can't be coerced, it needs to be ongoing, people have the right to change their mind, it needs to be informed, so this was a really big issue with our case study. Accessible, so that means like if you're researching somebody that might have, maybe they have a concussion, so they're not processing information very well, then you need to make sure that that information is broken into very small chunks. If you're doing a research study with like a 3-year-old, you're going to get consent from the parents, but you also need to get consent from the 3-year-old. And with the 3-year-old, that consent might be asking, like, do you want to play this game? And if the child says no, respecting that. Or if the child starts to cry, assuming that they no longer want to play anymore. So researchers, REBs, institutions, and guardians all share a responsibility to protect vulnerable research participants.
Would like minorities within like I don't know.
The question is being part of a marginalized population a vulnerability? And the answer is kind of yes and kind of no. Because on one hand, it's sort of paternalistic to assume that just because you're part of a marginalized population that you can't make your own decisions and they can't contribute to research. On the other hand, there are historical realities and power imbalances that mean that in some situations, yes. And we're going to talk about that next. Okay, so the principle of justice relates to this idea that there are power imbalances that can exist between a researcher and a participant, and there are also realities of oppression and power differences in societies that can contribute to inequalities. Okay. Who is included versus excluded is a key question around justice and a key question that we were just talking about. So I'm so glad you asked that question because it really just feeds so nicely into this. Equitable inclusion is this idea that no group should bear an unfair share of the burdens of participating in research or be unfairly excluded from the potential benefits of research participation. When we're talking about recruitment, we want to make sure that participants should be matched to the targeted population of interest. They shouldn't be picked because of convenience. So convenience is not a valid reason for including or excluding certain participants. And again, we're going to revisit this when we talk about sampling methods in this course.
So I have heard this so many times that our research only focuses on binary sexes, like okay.
Is it okay? I mean, it's a great question. So the question is that we often see language like the study's only open to people who identify as male or female because it can create confounds. That's a term we're going to learn about later. If people cannot be easily categorized into these two groups. Is that valid? And we could argue that there are strong ethical arguments against that. And the thing to recognize is that, as we talked about in the first class, science is objective, but it's not. It's constantly changing. So we have to strike this very careful balance between kind of wanting to protect research participants, but also making sure that in our desire to protect research participants, that we're not unfairly excluding them from research that could be benefiting them. Okay, so why does this all matter? Well, I mean, it matters in part because as I hope you know, as people who are pursuing psychology or psychology-adjacent careers, science is really important to society, right? You know, like you don't want to be a psychology major or a neuroscience major or specialist or a mental health specialist or major unless you believe that science is important to society, right? That's the core principle of these fields of study. So if you believe that, then you as a budding psychologist or neuroscience or mental health professional really have a responsibility to society as a whole to make sure that science is conducted and viewed as a trustworthy enterprise. So ethical violations are bad for science because they erode the public's trust in science as a way of knowing. So scientists have a responsibility to behave in ways that benefit society and ensure public trust. And one of the ways that we do that is through the principle of integrity. We want to be accurate and truthful and honest when reporting our research methods and our results. Even maybe the ugly, complex parts. That case discussion that we discussed was ugly in the sense that it was complex and it was messy and it was bad. It was really, really bad that people were put in these ethical dilemmas, that people were, that this research hadn't, kind of considered all of the potential implications of that. And so for the researchers to put themselves out there as the subjects of a case study is consistent with these values of science, that we should be transparent about our processes, even when we're making mistakes. Okay, so we're going to continue to learn about scientific integrity as we start to talk more about the specific research methods that researchers can use to study various phenomenon.